All right, guys, what's up? And welcome back to the channel. This is Jack, and today is going to be a very special video. We're going to be going over my personal top 10 Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, or SNES as it's called a lot today, of all time. Now, this is my personal list. It's also games that I've played, and I've owned most of them or played these games at a friend's house as well. So this is kind of my own personal list. So for those of you guys that are watching, if you need to, grab a drink, grab some popcorn, a snack, I don't know, grab some duct tape and a bedpan if you need to, and we're going to get into it because this is going to be a long one, but it's going to be a fun one. So without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, and one more thing. This is also going to be like not a ranking. This is just basically like, I love all these games for different reasons. They're basically like all legendary games to me. So this is not like a traditional top 10 to where the worst game would be number 10, and then the one that's slightly better is number 9, and so on until we get to the best game. These are basically 10 of the most legendary games of the Super Nintendo era, in my humble opinion. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so the first game on my list is Donkey Kong Country. I am pretty sure that every single person that owned a Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or should I say at least 80% or so of people that owned a Super Nintendo Entertainment System owned Donkey Kong Country. And the way I got my hands on this game was basically through a neighbor. A neighbor came over and said, hey, I got this game, and he brought it over to my house. And we basically played the living shit out of it, and I liked it so much in every single aspect. The graphics were great, the music was great, the gameplay was great. I liked it so much that I put my best puppy dog face on and basically begged my mom to let's go and get it. And with some persuasion and puppy dog face and stuff like that, she caved, and lo and behold, I ended up getting the game that night, and God knows how long I stayed up playing that game. Probably until I couldn't keep my eyes open, and I just played that game and just until I just probably passed out with the controller still in my hand. Donkey Kong Country is just one of those rare and special games, made by Rare, by the way, that basically also took a very interesting approach in terms of how they did their animations and stuff like that, and their art design. And a lot of other games after that actually started taking that kind of technique in order to develop their art design, to make everything look a lot more 3D and stuff like that, and it was very good. The soundtrack to this game is second to none. The gameplay is just so smooth. Even by today's standards, Donkey Kong Country still is a very smooth game. If you get yourself an old Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and if you play Donkey Kong Country, it is very smooth. It is very responsive. The boss battles are awesome. There's a lot of humor. The game has its own style, and it was really a treasure of a game back in the day. And not only that, the two sequels, Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, were also very good games and very successful. I didn't play the third one all that much, barely actually, but I played the living hell out of the second one. But for the sake of sequels and only being limited to one, I would have put Donkey Kong Country 2 on this list. But at the same time, there are a multitude of different games that are deserving of this list, in my humble opinion, that I've also had experiences with at one point in time or another, that are literally legendary games in my book. But Donkey Kong Country just hits all the right notes in so many different ways, in terms of the level design, the classic platforming style of gameplay, the graphics, the soundtrack, and when it kind of goes together and it molds all together, it is not only a complete package, but it is how do I put this? It's masterfully put together when you think about it in every single aspect. Like, every single category of how you would grade this game is pretty much an A when you think about it. So they added a little bit of the Mario formula into it as well, and they did it right. Obviously, it has its own type of gameplay and stuff like that. You can switch between Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong whenever you wanted. If you wanted something a little bit faster, or if you wanted to be a little bit smaller in order to avoid damage whenever you're jumping in between things, Diddy was your guy. If you wanted, if you needed to play as Donkey, there was a couple of techniques that you could do that you couldn't do with Diddy that you could with Donkey. Like, for instance, he would slap the ground with his hands, and if there was something hidden under, it would pop up. Obviously, he was slower, but he had his own little barrel roll. Diddy had his cartwheel, but was faster and can fit in smaller places. But Donkey Kong was still Donkey Kong, and obviously they both had their perks. Let's put it that way. But Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong were awesome, and it was really cool how you could just switch on the fly between either one of them. Donkey, I don't think Donkey would add any damage to anybody. I mean, the damage ratio is pretty much the same whether you're playing as Donkey Kong or Diddy Kong. But for me personally, I don't know about you guys, but I ended up switching to Diddy right from the get-go because he was just so much faster. I absolutely adored the cartwheel technique. I would use that to take out people. And just the fact that he was just overall faster was something that was very, very appealing to me. But for anybody that owns an SNES, it's pretty dang certain that these people own Donkey Kong Country and probably all of its sequels. And even to this day, I still like to go back and every once in a while look at playthroughs or even listen to the soundtracks with some of the other games on this list as well. And it's that good. I kid you not. So these are the many reasons as to why Donkey Kong Country is on this list, and it is and will forever be, in my opinion, a legendary SNES game. Mortal Kombat 2. You know, I don't think there is anybody that could basically doubt the amazing effectiveness that Mortal Kombat 2 had during its time in 1993. In 1992, Mortal Kombat 1 came out, and in 1992, Mortal Kombat 2 came out. And Mortal Kombat 2 is a prime example of what a sequel should be. And the developers didn't even have a break throughout making the Mortal Kombat games, especially the classic ones. They basically just went from one to the next to the next to the next in development because the popularity of the game, and they just needed more and more, and they just kept, they barely had time to stop developing. And Mortal Kombat 2 basically had twice as many characters as the first game. It obviously continued the story. There was more blood than the first game. There were, I think, 4 times the amount of finishers, or 5 times the amount of finishers, because in the first one there was just one fatality and then there was one pit fatality. Well, there were multiple stage fatalities or pit fatalities in Mortal Kombat 2, and then there was 2 fatalities per character, and then a couple of hidden things, a couple of hidden characters like Smoke and Jade. There were also friendships and babalities that basically, like, if you finish somebody, you can turn them into a baby version of themselves, or you can do a friendship, which is pretty much the opposite of what a fatality is. So this actually added some humor into the game, and it was basically, like, if you think about it, it was the beginning of what NetherRealm is today in terms of establishing, like, the type of game that they're making, because they don't want the game to be taken too seriously, right? So it was actually genius that they added in fatalities, animalities and babalities, and just different things in the game that would just kind of make you laugh a little bit. Even the fatalities themselves, right? I mean, they would be ridiculous, but it'd be kind of like funny and shit like that, to where, I mean, and the soundtrack was really good, specifically the arcade, obviously, because when it comes to porting things on the SNES from an arcade version, 9 times out of 10, the arcade version is just that much better. There is another game on this list that is an exception to that rule, and when we get to that game, we'll obviously probably talk about that, but Mortal Kombat 2 was just a game that completely had me going to the arcades in the 90s, and I spent literally all my time and all my money, in quarters or in tokens or whatnot, on Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2 was just that good. And obviously, even after the game came out on home consoles, which in my case was the SNES, I had it on multiple other consoles as well, but for the most part, it was the SNES that was the best one in my opinion, and my favorite one overall, I believe. I was constantly looking for the one that would be like an arcade version, but it just never happened back in the day. But Mortal Kombat 2, I kept going back to the arcade and playing it even after it came out on home consoles. And then eventually one day I went to the arcades looking for MK2, and I would completely ignore it because MK3 would come out or whatnot. But to this day, a lot of Mortal Kombat fans like myself, I played Mortal Kombat more than any other fighting game, or maybe any other game in general, when I was a kid. I would probably say that the majority of the fans consider Mortal Kombat 2 to probably be the best out of the classic Mortal Kombat games, like in terms of like the sequels or whatnot, or the classic ones. Like if you're looking at MK1, 2, and 3, I'm sure there are some people that would have their opinions on differing opinions on which one is the best for their own personal taste, which is great. But all in all, when you look at the entirety of Mortal Kombat 2 and what Mortal Kombat 2 did, continuing the lore, the soundtrack, the sound effects, the gameplay was even better and faster and smoother. More blood, more fatalities, more stage fatalities. You're putting in everything in between. Mortal Kombat 2 is the definition of what an amazing sequel was and should be, actually. It was just more of what we did and then a continuation to carry things forward. So in terms of the lore and what happened after Mortal Kombat 1 and everything like that, it was done very, very well. So props to the gentleman that continued to make Mortal Kombat throughout the years, man, because it was an amazing sequel, and it was probably my overall, it's really hard to say, but it was definitely one of my favorite fighting games of the 90s. Like, it's in my top 3. So yeah, let's get on to the next game. FZero. You know, in my mind, I kept on going back and forth on this between this and Mario Kart. And Mario Kart is and will always be a legendary game, but I didn't own Mario Kart. But I do remember I either owned FZero or I do remember this for sure, that I played it a heck of a lot. And I was just really enthralled by the speed. And another thing that I liked about it was it had a lot of futuristic elements into it that I liked. And parts of it also reminded me of the Neon Knight Rider stage from Turtles in Time. So it kind of gave me a lot of those vibes, but just more of them, which I absolutely loved. And the speed in and of itself, as well as the addictiveness of the game and the power-ups and everything like that, and the side of the track to where you could gain speed, or things you can bump into and lose speed, obviously. That kind of gameplay, like, it was like, if you think about it, it was like with some of these games, when you go over them, it's like the speed is like, it was like the thing that just I loved about so many games. It was, I really like things that were really fast back then, and to this day I still do. And FZero is just another one of those games to where it's just addictive once you get your hands on it. And back then, as simple of a concept as it was compared to what we would be getting today with a lot of the kart racing games today, or the just racing games in general today, FZero's foundation of what they did and having a futuristic and speedy version of what would be like a kart style game or just a racing game in general was definitely a good take. And the game was pleasant to look at. There were like different angles and stuff like that, like before the match when you get ready and stuff like that. And it was back then in the 90s, it was just something that was really appealing, and it's something that was just appealing to the eye back then had even more of an impact than it has today, in my opinion, because today we're just kind of used to things because of how far we've come. And back then things were still like developing and being created, and we're pretty much precursors of what we're getting today. So FZero is, again, like a lot of these other games, is a precursor of what we're getting today. And if it wasn't for games like such as this one, we wouldn't have the kind of games that we'd be getting today. We're talking like everything from Wipeout, Need for Speed and everything like that. And obviously FZero games continued to get made. I remember I had one of them for the Nintendo GameCube. I believe it was called FZero GX. So these games really did have an impact back in the day. And even when you take out, like, if you were to like actually get your hands on that game today, there would still be elements about it that would be like, it would get even a person of today's generation to understand, like, oh, okay, I see why people talk about this game, or why people would have liked this game, because of the unique feel, the unique look, and also, again, just like everything else, the soundtrack. There were so many good original Super Nintendo games that had amazing soundtracks, and it's really something you can't ignore, because it really just immerses you into the type of tempo and into the type of game that you're playing. Granted, it still does to this day, but in terms of the resources they had then to create all these unique sounds and the beats and everything like that, compared to what we get today, is absolutely nothing. But like, if you were to actually just listen to some of these soundtracks, man, it's like, wow, it really just matches, because sometimes you get a game or you get a movie or something like that to where the music just seems like it doesn't always fully match. Well, with this game, the music really definitely matched the type of game that you got, and it just allowed you to immerse yourself that much more into the game, which made the game that much of a better experience, really. And obviously, if you had friends, it was more fun with friends, and you couldn't deny that. You couldn't deny playing with friends. It's one of those games to where you can just call your neighbor over or your friend over and be like, hey, let's play some F-Zero, and you'd be playing for God knows how long, and the time would go fast. The time would go by so fast, and it would just be an absolute blast. So F-Zero, specifically for me, made this list over Mario Kart, specifically because it's a game that I played a lot of compared to Mario Kart. And what it did for me basically had me going back to that game as opposed to what Mario Kart was. Was Mario Kart awesome? Yes, but F-Zero, for me, personally, just kept me coming back because of its theme, the futuristic tone, and the speed. So, and that's why F-Zero made this list. All right, so how can you talk about the best SNES games of all time without mentioning the very first one, and one that remains legendary to this day, Super Mario World? From the moment you boot up that game and you put the cartridge in, you turn the power switch on or whatever, you just have that amazing theme, and it just kind of sticks with you forever. And it was basically like the next generation Mario 3. Because Mario 3 for regular Nintendo is an absolutely legendary game. If I was doing a list of top 10 NES games, Mario 3 would be on that list. And Super Mario World for the SNES was basically Mario 3 to the nth degree, with a few added features and stuff like that. Themes and a look that was unique for the game. It kept everything that made Mario so good, like, intact. It didn't really get rid of that, and it only added to it. And again, there were multiple worlds and everything like that. There were like different power-ups and everything, and obviously the game looked better, which back then, especially since everything was starting to form, back then was a big deal. If a system had really good graphics, or if a game had really good graphics, it would be something that would be widely known, and it would pretty much guarantee a sale for that game, just off of graphics alone. But Mario not only looked better than what was presented on the NES, obviously, just like every other SNES game, but again, the themes, the music, the power-ups, the gameplay, really smooth, really responsive, and just, it is what legendary games are made of. Super Mario World, for everybody that is around my age range, or even slightly younger, the majority of people will consider that game the most legendary SNES games, because it obviously came with the system, and it was basically like your first impression of what the console would have to offer and what the games for that generation would have to offer. And for me, Super Mario World is an A+ game. I mean, it would be really hard. It would be, if I had to grade the game and put it this would be in my top 3, because it's just that good. It's just that good. And not only that, it kept you coming back for more. You wanted to keep playing, even when you beat the game, right? You still wanted to come back and play it, because it was just such a joy to play. You would want to play it again and again and again. You would want to revisit the worlds and the power-ups and the bad guys and all that kind of stuff again and again and again. You wanted to hear the music from the very beginning of the level again and again and again. That is what legendary games are made of, and Mario absolutely, positively succeeded. It's really hard for me to tell you which world is my favorite when it comes to the Mario games. They all have very unique themes and looks about them. And as a child, and I'm thinking about this as I was when I was a child, it's like, what made me come back to Mario? What made me love Mario in the first place? And sometimes it's really hard to put it into words, but this is the answer to that question. Basically, it's one of those things that you have to experience to fully understand. So therefore, it's kind of hard to understand it just through words alone, because the words sometimes for a game like this aren't enough. You have to. That's why I kind of. I wish that everybody just for a few minutes could kind of just be at my age back then in the early 90s and just kind of experience that for themselves, because it really was kind of like the golden era of gaming, really, because everything was coming up, everything was getting better. It wasn't exactly like it is today, but in terms of the way the thought process works from developing games, but you could tell from these kind of games that there was nothing but passion from the developers that were put into games, and that is why these games are just, a lot of these games are just so legendary, and that's why they're talked about throughout the years and throughout the decades, because there was nothing but passion and art form presented to you in the form of a video game, and you had a great time playing it, and you kept coming back and playing it again and again, and that is why Super Mario World is a legendary game. Demon's Crest. Now, Demon's Crest was a game that just completely kind of blindsided me. So I had a friend that maybe a couple times a month, give or take, would come over and he would have a sleepover once or twice every month on the weekends when we didn't have school. And I remember specifically there was, and he came over, right? He came over and he brought a game with him and he thought it was like one of the coolest games ever. And on top of that, he couldn't beat it. So like there was it was like the pre-final boss that he couldn't get through. And basically what we would do is we would take turns playing the game, and whichever one of us would die in the levels, would give up the controller. And basically we got to the semi-final boss and then my boss. So he couldn't beat the boss before the last one, and I couldn't beat the final boss. So what we did was he obviously gave me the sticks, and he basically said, listen, you're going to keep playing this no matter how many times you die until you get it, because you're getting a lot closer to beating this boss before I am. And then eventually I got it, and it was like a huge jump for joy. We got up and we were like jumping, and it was like a huge celebration. And then we saw the final boss, and he and I just looked at each other like, oh shit, this guy's going to be tough. I personally couldn't understand how he couldn't get through the pre-final boss, but I guess it's just the way he plays and compared to how I play. So Demon's Crest was one of those games that had a lot of longevity, and there were so many different powers that you can get. Like once you defeat an enemy, you kind of get their powers or whatnot, and you have a different appearance. And there are multiple worlds that you can visit and things to find and everything like that. It was a platformer, a side-scrolling platformer or whatnot, but it was really cool. You could fly, you could glide, you can climb walls and stuff. It was almost like Super Metroid, but just a different feel, different flavor, obviously a different story. And the game soundtrack really had this it really blended in very well with the game. So, and basically you had to go and get all the crests from all the all the different bosses that you get or whatnot, and you'd get powers and stuff like that, and you'd visit different worlds and everything. And basically I didn't even own the game. Basically when I played that game, it was whenever he would come over, and we wouldn't beat it. We didn't beat it on the first weekend. I think we beat it on the time where his mom actually gave permission for him to stay 2 nights in a row, which was epic. And we basically spent the majority of that time trying to beat that game. And I believe that was the weekend when we did, and it was fun as hell. It was a great time. It was a fun time. And it was a challenge, but it was a fun challenge. Again, back in the day when the only way to play was when you'd have friends come over, and this was a single player game. It wasn't a 2-player game. And the way you would play them is just pass on the sticks. It's like, okay, you lost, or let's say you got through the level. It's like, okay, let your friend play until they die or until they, beat the level. It all depends on how you specifically enjoyed playing that game. But Demon's Crest was fucking amazing. It was fun as hell. And I really didn't need to own that game, really, because we played it so much. I think I rented it a couple of other times from Blockbuster. Shout out to Blockbuster. And to those who remember Blockbuster, I know that there are those that are probably watching this video that are also fans of Hollywood Video, which is totally understandable. Some people preferred Blockbuster, some people preferred Hollywood Video, and some people just didn't give a damn. It was both. But back in those days, even if I didn't have my friend come over, and if I really wanted to play that game, I would try to get permission to see if we could go to Blockbuster and rent it. And more often than not, we would always be late in returning the game or the movie or whatever it was that was rented. But yeah, it was a whole hell of a lot of fun. And those days to where you can just, you can couch co-op. Basically, that's all there was back in the day. So, and that's why to this day, I mean, there's no experience quite like being there with your friend and experiencing everything together compared to watching it online or watching it on stream. it's good to be able to experience those games without having to go outside of your house or go to a friend's house if you can't do it, if you don't want to. But it's a whole other different when you're couch co-oping and when you're passing on the sticks especially in a single player game. And that's how we did it back in the day. And the experience was that good, and I'll never ever forget it. And that's why I consider this game a legendary game. Yes, Street Fighter 2. Again, one of the first fighting games. It's the first fighting game I ever played. And Street Fighter 2. Now, I chose this one over the other iterations of Street Fighter 2 because there are so many different iterations of Street Fighter 2 throughout the 90s that were released and on multiple consoles. But I'm choosing specifically Street Fighter 2, the World Warrior, for SNES, simply because, not just because it was the first, but it was like I had played it in the arcade, and I had gotten into Street Fighter before I became aware of Mortal Kombat. And Street Fighter 2 was a game that I just kept on playing at the arcades as a kid. And when I had the opportunity to get it at home, it was like awesome. We ended up getting it. I wasn't supposed to get it. But again, Mom caved in, and she wanted me to have it, even though Dad said, no, we want to keep the money. He's like, don't tell Dad, but Dad ended up finding out. But I played the living hell out of Street Fighter 2, and there were also differences with the arcade that I could tell, even like with the uniforms that the fighters would wear. And basically, I had this knob adjuster on my little super small TV that would like change the colors, and I'm like, yeah, it looks a lot more like the arcade now. Ryu has his light bluish top that I like, his uniform that I liked in the arcades that is not in this version for the SNES. The only thing that sucked was that the game was also really, really slow. Because it wasn't turbo, it was because of the frames and stuff like that. But obviously they fixed that in the next game. But it sucked. But it was still a whole hell of a lot of fun to play. And I went to my friend's house and we played it. We liked it a lot. We also got a kick out of Ken's theme. It was the first time we ever heard Ken's theme, and Ken's theme to this day is pretty fucking awesome. I still listen to it to this day. Maybe not this original version, but like there's so many different versions. There's somebody on YouTube that created a full-on rock version, like from scratch, and it was so good. So good. Some really talented people, man. YouTube is just such an amazing place where people can really showcase their talents. But I remember I could not get past Balrog to save my life, and then I finally did. And then there was Vega, and I couldn't get past him for the life of me. And then it took me like weeks to do that. And then I'm like, yay, I'm done. No, I wasn't done. There was Sagat after that. And then I'm like, okay, this guy is absolutely huge. I gotta be done. But nope. After that, there was M. Bison. And it took me forever to get through Bison. Bison was so cheap back in the day. It was ridiculous. Balrog was hard. Vega was harder. Sagat was even harder. And Bison, I believe, from memory, was the hardest. I had to keep on playing, but I was fairly sure that it was the last boss. I was sure that Bison was the last one, because he was the only one that had a little animation before you got to fighting, right? Because he'd wear his cape, and then all of a sudden he would remove his cape, and then the fight would ensue. And that to me, even as a kid, I got a hint that, okay, if that's happening, then that is definitely the last boss. And on top of that, how hard he was, yeah. But I didn't quit for every single time I played. And eventually, after a certain amount of weeks or so, give or take, I don't fully remember, I finally just got through Bison. I think I was able to get through Balrog, Vega, and Sagat a little bit easier because of the amount of time that I put into it, and I knew their moves better, and I knew what to expect. But with Bison was just cheap, man. There's no other way around it. It's like he knew what you were gonna do before you did it, and it was just cheap, man. But Ryu and Ken were my mains. I liked both of them. I would switch between those two because they played so similar, and I liked it. I think Ken was slightly faster. I don't know if in that SNES version of the game, if there was any noticeable difference because of the frame rate limits or whatnot, and because of how slow that game played in comparison to the turbo versions. But Ryu and Ken were usually the ones that I went for. I did enjoy Honda with his super fast slap and stuff like that, and I enjoyed some of the other guys, but usually it was Ryu or Ken that I would play as. So the music, the fact that it was my first fighting game and the first one that I took home, and is such a legendary game, and it was the beginning of what Street Fighter would be today. And Street Fighter 6 is actually I'm very excited about, actually, in terms of what they're doing. But yeah, Street Fighter 2, the World Warrior, legendary game. Turtles in Time. Wow. Turtles in Time is just so damn legendary in so many different ways. So the way I was first introduced to Turtles in Time back in the day was through a best friend's birthday. My best friend at the time, when we were in elementary school, basically had his birthday and I came over and we had a little party or whatnot. It was a lot of fun, and he was opening his presents, and then one day he opened it up and it was a Super Nintendo game. It was called Turtles in Time. He opened it up, he was like, "Oh, Turtles in Time!" And then we rushed over to his room. We plugged that thing in. We co-opted it because you could play up to 2 players. You couldn't do 4 players like in the arcade. And it was so good in so many different ways. It was ridiculous. It was like the soundtrack was immediately like, we were both familiar with Turtles. Like, if you're a 90s kid, or if you were born in the mid 80s and you grew up in the 90s or whatnot, there was no way in hell you were not a fan of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And Turtles in Time was the best of the Turtles games that came out. Even the ones after that came out after in the 90s were not as good as Turtles in Time. They added in a few additional levels that were not in the arcades, which was great. And I believe a couple of boss battles. They changed one up. They changed the boss battle, and they also added a boss battle, which was the Shredder, where you had to throw the bad guys to the screen in order to get rid of Shredder. So in the Technodrome. So they added Neon Knight Riders, I believe, as well. And the soundtrack is better than the arcade version, in my opinion. The only thing that the soundtrack didn't have in the SNES version was the theme, the original Turtles theme that was in the arcade version that wasn't in the SNES version. But when you're talking about stages from stage 1, from Big Apple 3 AM, Alley Cat Blues, Sewer Surfing, like all those, all versions of those on the SNES are superior to the arcade. Believe it or not, they're better than the arcade versions. They just pop more, they sound better or whatnot. Konami, and this was when Konami was absolutely legendary. Konami just did such an amazing job with that port of the game. And it was a game that you would come back and play. It would only take you about an hour to beat, but there was also a hard version. And the thing is, like, if you played the hard version, you'd get like an additional 1 or 2 additional continues if you died, if you lost all your lives, obviously. But if you played it on easy, you'd get less continues, but it would be way easier. And then in the middle, I mean, it was a challenging game. And even the reshelled version that came out, like, God knows how many years later, was absolutely nothing in comparison to what we got with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in Time on the SNES. I wish they had taken a lot more aspects of the SNES version and put it into the reshelled version, but unfortunately it just didn't happen. I can appreciate what they tried to go for, but it just didn't have enough of what was the original Turtles. It's like they tried to combine the two worlds of what Turtles were back when the reshelled version came out, along with what Turtles was, and it's like, no, you can't do that. You gotta go either one or the other. And for those of you guys that have the Cowabunga collection, you obviously have the arcade and the SNES version. I recommend the SNES version. So if you have the Cowabunga collection, go back and play that SNES version. You'll see what I'm talking about if you haven't already. But Turtles in Time, the only thing that the arcade has overall on it is that you could play as all 4 turtles at once, but you can't do that in the SNES version, unfortunately. But you can play as 2, and it's a hell of a co-op game, and you can choose which turtle you want. But man, that game, for a multitude of different reasons, always had you coming back. There were multiple difficulties and stuff like that. I think there was also a time trial, maybe. And if you beat it on the hard version, you'd get like an extended ending or something like that. So there was a reason to play the hard version. So Turtles in Time is to me, it's that one game that definitely stands out above all else. And if I were to rank it, it would be in my top 3 probably. It's so impactful, and the fact that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from both movies as well as the cartoon show or whatnot were around then as well. It was just like they made the best Turtles games, and there were a lot of good Turtle games on the NES, in the NES as well. And they had the Hyperstone Heist, which is basically Turtles in Time version for the Genesis, but just different backgrounds and stuff like that. But the gameplay was pretty much the same, and the music wasn't as good. But Turtles in Time, to this day, is probably my overall favorite Ninja Turtles movie that ever existed. And that is why it is a legendary game on my list. Star Fox. You know, back in the day, I really was a fan of the flight games or space combat type of games, and Star Fox for me was like perfect. It wasn't too fancy, and the movement and the fluidity of the game was really good, but the graphics were fine back in the day. I know that Star Fox 64 is probably the most legendary version of what we got with the SNES, because they really beefed it up, but Star Fox for Super Nintendo it's one of those games that I didn't own. I owned a whole bunch of other ones. I didn't own it, but whenever I rented it, or whenever a friend had it and we went over to his house to play it, or when we had a sleepover party or something like that, we would play the living shit out of it, and it was addictive. I remember specifically with this game, with Star Fox, like when I had my first like legit good amount of time to play on it, rather than just kind of just watching and just occasionally picking up the controller. I remember when we had a sleepover at a friend's house. They didn't come to my house for a change. I actually went to their house. And I remember specifically everyone else, and there were about 4 or 5 of us. It was a big sleepover party. There were about 4 or 5 of us, and I was the only one left awake, and guess what I was doing? I was playing Star Fox. And everybody else was asleep. And I just stayed up and I played the game, and then I ended up falling asleep much later, and everybody else was up much sooner than me, and I just kept on sleeping or whatnot. So everybody else was asleep, and I stood up much later, and I remember just playing the living crap out of it. Now, I don't remember whether or not I beat it. All I remember was that the game was addictive as hell, and I really just enjoyed going in those rings and rolling and firing at the same time and dodging out of the way. And then obviously there were, I believe there were the boss battles as well. Or whenever you would obviously get to a certain point and you had to hit something that was weak or something like that. Like, I just really enjoyed. Like, I was also inspired by Star Wars, because a lot of the things I liked about Star Wars as a kid was like whenever they had the space, like in Empire Strikes Back, where they were going through the when they had in the end of episode 4, when they had the attack on the Death Star, or in Empire Strikes Back when they had the Battle of Hoth, or when in Return of the Jedi at the very end, like, I really like those space battles and stuff like that, and some of the pilots and some of the fighters would do something really cool, like going between legs and stuff like that, and I was inspired to do that when I played Star Fox. I thought that was really fucking cool, and the fact that I was inspired to do that just made me play the game in a way that I otherwise wouldn't play it. It just made me want to get fancier and stuff like that. I don't remember if that game rewarded you for being fancy. I don't remember that far back. But all I remember was that I was addicted to that kind of gameplay and that kind of combat. And it was like the first game of its kind that really got me into, back then at least, got me into what would be space combat type of games. And I've played a few Star Wars ones as well. I played on PC when I was 12 years old, when I went to my friend's house for like a week or two, when he moved from where we were living to a different area a couple hours away. I remember on his dad's computer we played a game called Terminal Velocity. That was a space combat game as well. So I was really fond of those type of games, and Star Fox was the first to do that, and it obviously was offered on the SNES, which was great. So the fact that we got something like that for Super Nintendo was really a joy to be had, and as basic as it was compared to what we have today, it was fun as hell to play, man. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's what it is. And obviously, the sound effects were really good. The soundtrack was really good. I mean, just so many good things. I mean, this is why these games are so legendary, is because they played well, they sounded well, they looked good. And Star Fox is absolutely no exception. So for space combat games, that game was fun as hell. And I'm sure that there are fans of Star Fox that stuck with it ever since. So Star Fox, in my opinion, was another game that just... It was different, obviously, than most of the other games I played, but it still sucked me in, despite the fact that it was a different type of game to play. And that is why it is a legendary status game of the Super Nintendo era in my book. Contra 3. Wow. Again, another very similar story to where I went to a friend's house and he was playing one of the Contras, and I'm pretty sure it was Contra 3. It could have been Super Contra, I'm not sure. But Contra 3 ranks in a lot of people's top game, and I don't see why I wouldn't rate it as such. So Contra was basically like your ultimate side-scroller shooter in a sense. You know, you could jump, you know, you can side-scroll and basically shoot at angles, straight up, straight to the right, or a little bit down at a down angle. You can jump and shoot below. It was pretty badass, and you'd have like these monstrous battles and boss fights and stuff like that. Sometimes you'll have different points of view from the camera in terms of how the stage or a boss battle would be. Contra was, it basically took the shooting element and put it into your basic side scroller, but it was all about basically dodging bullets, and then sometimes even shooting at bullets if you had the weapon to do so, and taking out enemies. And there were a ton of guns to use. I think the most popular one was the spread gun, to where like it would be like you couldn't miss. You honestly couldn't miss, and it was overpowered. And you would basically just hold on to that weapon. There was I think there was flamethrowers as well. There were guns that would lock onto people and shit like that, all sorts of launchers and shit. You know, you could get power-ups and stuff like that. Contra took a very, very basic concept and just like basically Modern Warfare 2'd it basically. And I'm talking about the original Modern Warfare 2, not Modern Warfare the second. To where everything was powerful, everything was ridiculous, you know, and with the boss battles and stuff like that, it's like there was no way in hell you would not get addicted to Contra. And as a matter of fact, Contra and what Contra did was just so popular and so influential that there were a lot of games, like movie licensed games, like the RoboCops, or like a RoboCop versus Terminator, for instance, that took the gameplay aspect and concept of what Contra did and applied that into their game, which made it a good game as well. Now, granted, there were also different variations. I know the Genesis version of certain games just played completely different and looked a little bit different from the SNES versions, but ultimately, at the end of the day, when you have a game that basically inspires other developers or other companies to do something similar to what you did, it just goes to show of how right that one thing you did just was. And it was very basic. It really didn't have to be anything too fancy. I mean, you got two guys and you can play at the same time with your friend, obviously. You know, one of them's red, one of them's blue, and you're basically going out there and you're shooting shit up, and you're getting from the left side of the level to the right side of the level, and you got bad guys trying to shoot you in between. You're picking up weapons, you're a multitude of different weapons that you can obviously switch or drop or whatnot, power-ups and stuff like that, and ridiculous boss fights with like aliens and all sorts of shit. Contra was just addictive, and it really didn't matter whether you, like, how often you died and all that kind of stuff. Like, it was that kind of game to where the look, the feel, and the sound just made you come back. And it was basically a different iteration of what like a side-scrolling beat-em-up was, or a side-scrolling platformer. It was a side-scrolling shooter, basically, an action adventure shooter. And they definitely played and dealt their cards right with Contra. And Contra 3 is said to be, I believe, the best of the bunch. So, despite the fact that I never owned it, when I played it, you couldn't, like, it would take a lot to get me off of the controller. And if you were a fan of different types of games that were side-scrollers, such as, you know, like, let's say, let me take a book from the Genesis here for a second, like Streets of Rage, right? Contra was basically like Streets of Rage, except it was like you would shoot people instead of like doing the whole beat 'em up thing. So yeah, Contra was awesome, and I'm actually kind of surprised that they never brought Contra back. I think that's something that Microsoft should do, or Sony. Like, bring Contra back, dude, in today's generation. Make it a first-person shooter, a third-person shooter. Hell, keep it a side-scroller like they did with Metroid Dread for the for the Switch. Keep everything like it was, except update the graphics, make the frame rates obviously better, update, you know, boss battles and stuff like that, and how you can find shit. Contra needs to come back, man. Why hasn't it already? It was too damn good. So, I mean, if a game like Killer Instinct can be brought back, let's bring back Contra. Killer Instinct. All right, this is the last game on the list, and there was no way in the world that I was going to leave Killer Instinct out, and I'm going to tell you why. as I mentioned earlier in the video, Mortal Kombat 2 was the game that had me glued to the arcades, basically back in the 90s, right? Until one day, there was a game in the arcades that was making a lot of noise. The music was really high, and it was also the game that in the arcade version was the first arcade game to play at 60 FPS, by the way, in the form of Killer Instinct. And me being a Mortal Kombat purist and just, you know, not knowing a thing about Killer Instinct and all that kind of stuff, basically kept me away. And then one person that knew me from the arcades, because I would visit there frequently on a weekly basis, basically said, dude, you need to play this game. And I did. And let's just say ever since I started playing it, I didn't stop. It was the game that kept me away from Mortal Kombat 2 until Mortal Kombat 3 came out. But I would always go back and play it because it was Killer Instinct. And until that day, I never ever had experienced a game quite like that before, because it had a unique look. The characters were obviously in full 3D. The graphics were absolutely amazing. The soundtrack is, in my opinion, till this day, the best video game soundtrack of all time. The arcade version, at least. The best video game soundtrack of all time for a fighting game or just any game in general. And there were... wow. I was just so impressed with the... Like, it was... And it didn't even play like Mortal Kombat. They had a combo system. If you get like a 3-hit combo, it would be like, you know, super combo, master combo, and then you'd figure out how to do the ultra combo. It was ultra combo. Like, it was the most epic voiceover in a game ever. Like, everything was just so good. If you thought Mortal Kombat's like round 1 fight was good, it's like Killer Instinct basically beat the living shit out of that. And it was loud. And also another thing, true story, true fact, if you would get more, like the higher of a hit combo you get, the announcer would be even louder. So if you went to killer combo, it would be like louder. If monster combo, killer combo, and then obviously ultra combo would be the big one. Ultra combo! Like, wow. And there were so many different characters you can play as. You know, you had an alien from space that was made out of ice. You had a fire guy named Cinder. You had a werewolf named Saberwolf. You had the ninja. You had his sister Orchid and stuff like that. You even had finishers, not as good as MK's, but they were still good. Some of them were even funny. One of them, you know, Orchid, the female, would take her bra off and the person would have a heart attack and die. But like, if you were to type in right now on YouTube, Killer Instinct arcade soundtrack, like arcade, and the SNES version of it not only came with a black cartridge, which made it look really cool, but it also came with the arcade disc. So back then, if you had a CD player, you would put that shit in. I didn't have a CD player, but I remember the disc being there, and it was badass, man. You had the entire soundtrack given to you right there with the game. It was that good, and the soundtrack was really good, and it was like everything from the character select, and you can choose whichever color you wanted that character to be just by pressing up or down on the joystick was awesome. And the SNES version of that game was still incredible. Like, wow. Killer Instinct was that other side to the coin that Mortal Kombat wasn't. And for a game to have that much of an impact to where the fans would stick with it, even though another game wouldn't come out for like another 18 years, like a sequel or another iteration of the game wouldn't come out for 18 years, says a lot. And Microsoft is the one that picked up on it and gave it to the fans. And it ended up being one of the best fighting games ever. And from a competitive standpoint as well. It didn't do everything that the original Killer Instinct did in terms of like the finishers and stuff like that, but still, man, it was Killer Instinct in 2013, and then they obviously had multiple seasons for it, and a lot of people are calling for a sequel. It was one of the best competitive fighting games ever, and its netcode was really good when you play online. Like, wow. I think it's going to be only a matter of time until a sequel gets released in terms of Killer Instinct as of today, but the original game that started it all was just that damn good. If you are a person of the 90s or just a person that just loves 90s that didn't necessarily get into fighting games, do yourself a favor and just YouTube it right now. Killer Instinct arcade soundtrack. And the main theme is just so good. And even some of the levels and stuff like that, so good. I mean, it's just everything about the game was just absolutely fantastic. And the way it played in the arcade was even better. And in the SNES version, again, it was a game that I bought and it had kept me coming back, and I wanted to play and beat the game on every single character, figure out all the ultra combos and finishers for every character and stuff like that. And the combo system was actually the thing that got me really hooked on that game. I really loved the combo system, and I love the fact that the announcer would just say, you know, ultra combo, which was obviously a finisher that you had to do towards the end of the match. But yeah, it was completely different. It was a different take on the fighting game genre in terms of how it played and how it looked, how it sounded, how it felt. And it was successful, man. And I'm glad that even though it took them forever, I'm glad they made a sequel. They made a sequel back then too, but it wasn't as widely received, I guess. But no, Killer Instinct will, even if we never see another Killer Instinct again, Killer Instinct of 1995 will forever be legendary. It had that much of an impact. It got people's eyes off of Mortal Kombat. That's how legendary it was. But anyway, guys, that's all I got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I want you to tell me what your top 10 lists are, and what do you think of the list? And tell me also some of your memories down in the comment section that you had, not just in the generation of Nintendo, but just like in terms of like your personal experience with some of these games. And let me know what you want to see next in terms of which video game console, because back in the day as a kid, I had a lot of them. So let me know. We might do Genesis next. We might do something else. Just let me know. Give me some ideas, man. I love it. I love it when you guys give me feedback. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had a lot of fun watching this as I had making it. I'll catch you guys on the next one.